Up in Canada. As your friendly neighbor to the north, I've been playing group hug decks for a while now, but I'm sick of it. So for my deck tech, I would like to see you build a group Slug deck around Mogis, God of Slaughter.
Today's episode is going to be a $50 deck tech. When I say $50, I mean that is an overall deck cost. Both shipping and commanders that are $10 or less are going to be included in that cost, but basic lands will not be. Decks on this channel are built to be fun, inexpensive, and focused. If you want to learn more about what a focused commander deck is, check out this video here. On this deck tech, I'm going to take you through its strategy, the tactics, and how this deck wins. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGplayer affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today's deck tech comes to you courtesy of Brandon Kilger. Brandon has been helping support this channel for over a year now as a general tier patron. I really couldn't do this without amazing patrons like Brandon. And today, he's actually going to handle the intro for me.
Hey Mitch, this is Brandon from Calgary up in Canada. As your friendly neighbor to the north, I've been playing group hug decks for a while now, but I'm sick of it. So for my deck tech, I would like to see you build a group Slug deck around Mogis, God of Slaughter.
So as Brandon said, today's deck tech is going to be a group Slug deck built around Mogis, God of Slaughter. A group Slug deck essentially looks to inflict as much pain as it can on everyone, so it's even going to be inflicting pain on itself. It's just hoping that it finishes off its opponents before it dies itself. Mogis is a fantastic choice for a group Slug commander. It's a 7/5 indestructible god that costs 2 black-red. It says as long as your devotion to black and red is less than 7, Mogis isn't a creature. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Mogis deals 2 damage to that player unless they sacrifice a creature. So Mogis can easily inflict a ton of pain on our opponents and have them make some really tough decisions. But we've got plenty of ways to make those decisions even harder and more painful. And because Mogis is indestructible, he's very hard for opponents to deal with. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, it's very simple. We're going to light the world on fire to inflict huge amounts of pain. The more damage that we can inflict on everyone, the better. And we've even got some ways to just hurt our opponents too and leave ourselves out of it. And how we win with this deck is very simple. We're going to work to make our opponents die before we do. Again, Mogis' effect and some of our others are one-sided. So we're going to be working to take everyone down as quickly as we can, and hopefully our opponents die first. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So it's time to start off with tactic number 1, rockin' around. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we've got Prismatic Lens and Mind Stone, both of which can tap for a colorless. And on top of that, Lens can actually filter our mana, and Mind Stone can draw us a card if we pay 1 and tap and sacrifice it. And then we're going to be running Sphere of the Suns, Star Compass, and Rakdos Signet. Sphere of the Suns enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for any color 3 times. Star Compass also enters the battlefield tapped, and can tap for any of our colors depending on our land situation. And by paying 1 and tapping Rakdos Signet, it's going to add black-red. Next up, we've got 3 mana rocks that are a little less efficient but have more utility. Crypto's Fragment enters battlefield tapped, and we can tap for any color and each player loses 1 life. Also, at the beginning of our upkeep, if each player has 10 or less life, we transform Crypto's Fragment. It transforms into Aura of Emrakul, and when it attacks, each opponent loses 3 life. An Unstable Obelisk taps for colorless, so we can pay 7 to tap and sacrifice it to destroy target permanent. Rakdos Locket taps for either of our colors, and we can pay Rakdos, and tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And then there's Hedron Archive, which taps for 2, and we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. So after we've ramped, it's time for us to make things even more painful for our opponents. So let's move on to tactic number 2, Salt on an Open Wound. First up, there's Curse of Bloodletting, which says if a source would deal damage to enchanted player, it deals double that much damage to that player instead. So if we put this on an opponent, it makes them a huge target, and it makes every single one of our damage effects doubly effective against them. But then we've got some ways to double up all damage with Furnace of Wrath and Dictate of the Twin Gods. Both say if a source would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that much damage to that permanent or player instead. And Dictate of the Twin Gods even has Flash, so we can take the most advantage of it first. So these can really speed up the game by doubling up every single player's damage. The more of these effects that we get in play, the more painful everything becomes. Mogis' upkeep trigger becomes even harder for our opponents to deal with. And then there's Gratuitous Violence and Angrass Mirage, which only double up our own damage. So these effects are a bit more under our control, but still, all these are very effective. Again, our goal is to deal a ton of damage to everyone very quickly. And outside of Mogis, we've got plenty of other ways to do that. Let's go through some of the ways in tactic number 3, bring the pain. First up, there's Pestilence, which lets us pay a black to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. So this can help us control the board on top of pinging everyone for a ton. And because Mogis is indestructible, this is going to stick around for quite a while. And then there's Sulfuric Vortex, which is going to deal 2 damage to each player during their upkeep. And on top of that, it doesn't allow players to gain life. This is a fantastic way to chip down our opponent's life totals throughout the game and not allow them to recover. But we've also got some quicker ways to do that too. We can tap Heartless Hitotsugu to deal damage to each player equal to half that player's life total rounded down. And then Havoc Festival says players can't gain life at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses half their life rounded up. Both of these can really speed things up and take everyone down quickly. And much like Sulfuric Vortex, Havoc Festival doesn't allow our opponents to recover. Next up, we've got some big one-shot effects with Direfleet Ravager and Fraying Omnipotence. When the Ravager enters the battlefield, each player loses a third of their life rounded up. And then Fraying Omnipotence says each player loses half their life, then discards half the cards in their hand, then sacrifices half the creatures they control, round up each time. Both of these are great effects that can really speed the game up out of nowhere and can really take our opponents by surprise. And finally, a way that we can really impact one player is with Captive Audience. When it comes into play, we give it to an opponent of our choice. And then at the beginning of their upkeep, they have to choose one that hasn't been chosen. Your life total becomes 4, discard your hand, or each opponent creates 5 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So this can pretty much be a death sentence to whoever we give this to. And while this does give the other players zombies, we've got plenty of ways to deal with them. And getting those zombies might even be a bad thing for them in the first place. Let's go through some ways that can make things even tougher on opponents in tactic number 4. Painful decisions. First up, there's Rampaging Frostodon, which says players can't gain life, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Frostodon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. So again, this is going to prevent our opponents from gaining any life back, and it's going to punish our opponents for playing creatures. Next up, there's Spell Shock, which says whenever a player casts a spell, Spell Shock deals 2 damage to that player. This card can be detrimental to a ton of decks and can put them in a very tough spot. Some other cards that can be very painful for everyone are Ankh of Mishra and Zozu the Punisher, because whenever a land comes into play, its controller is going to take 2 damage. So playing lands is going to be painful, but it's also going to be painful to actually use lands too. Burning Earth says whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, Burning Earth deals 1 damage to that player. And then Mana Barb says the exact same thing and even doesn't specify non-basic. So with this deck, we're making pretty much every single decision a very painful one. If they want to cast spells by tapping their lands, they're going to have to take some damage. They can choose not to do anything, but they're probably going to fall behind. But a way to make this an impossible decision for everyone comes from our Golden Pig. The Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Citadel of Pain. It's an enchantment for 2 in a red, and it says at the beginning of each player's end step, Citadel of Pain deals X damage to that player, where X is the number of untapped lands they control. So if we have this in combination with those other cards, we're guaranteed to deal some damage. Again, with this deck, we're going to be fine with taking damage as long as our opponents have to as well. We're pretty much going to be rolling the dice to see if we can take our opponents out before we take ourselves out. On its own, Citadel of Pain is a fantastic card, and it's even deadlier in combination with others. By itself, it gives our opponents a tough choice. Either take damage or tap out. It's especially effective against control decks and other decks that like to play at instant speed. It can make all these tough decisions for our opponents even tougher, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. Now, like I mentioned before, the reason that we're fine with dealing a ton of damage to ourselves is because we also have ways to just deal damage to opponents. So let's go through some of those ways in tactic number 5, Oppress the Opposition. First up, there's Harsh Mentor, which says whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or land on the battlefield, if it isn't a mana ability, Harsh Mentor deals 2 damage to that player. Incidental damage like this is a great way to make our opponents think twice or pay for their actions. And then Fate Unraveler says whenever an opponent draws a card, Fate Unraveler deals 1 damage to that player. Drawing cards is crucial in Commander, and this is going to punish our opponents for doing so. Next up, there's Crimson Honor Guard, which says at the beginning of each player's end step, Crimson Honor Guard deals 4 damage to that player unless they control a commander. Because Mogis is indestructible, it's very easy for us to keep it in play. And for the vast majority of commanders, that's not going to be the case. And because our commander is going to stay in play, Loyal Subordinates can be very effective. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if we control our commander, each opponent loses 3 life. And then Palace Siege has at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. As long as we don't have one of our ways that prevent life gain, gaining that life can come in handy. And finally, there's a way that punishes our opponents for even trying to gain life with Tainted Remedy. It says if an opponent would gain life, that player loses that much life instead. So this will stop our opponents from trying to gain life in most circumstances and can even hurt them in others. Certain commanders and cards have incidental life gain on them. So if our opponents want to play those, they're going to have to pay for it. But outside of these, we've got some big one-shot effects to hurt our opponents too. Let's go through them now in tactic number 6, Big Cuts. First up, we've got Cut to Ribbons. Cut's going to deal 4 damage to our creature, and Ribbons is going to make each opponent lose X life. Both these halves can be very useful with this deck. And then when Fanatic of Mogis enters the battlefield, it deals damage to each opponent equal to our devotion to red. With all the enchantments that we're running in this deck, we're probably going to have a good amount of devotion when this comes down. The same can be said for our black devotion for Gary. When Grey Merchant of Asphodel enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is our devotion to black, and we gain life equal to life lost this way. So this can be a fantastic way to give us some breathing room and put us way ahead of our opponents. But we're going to need some ways to get to all these great cards. So let's go through some ways that can help us in tactic number 7, The Hits Keep Coming. First up, there's Siphon Mine, which makes everyone else discard a card, and we draw a card for each card discarded this way. So essentially, this is going to draw us 3 cards. Next up, there's Spiteful Visions, which says at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and whenever a player draws a card, Spiteful Visions deals 1 damage to that player. So this will give everyone some extra cards, but it's also going to punish everyone for it. And then Bloodgift Even says at the beginning of your upkeep, target player draws a card and loses 1 life. 1 life for a card is a small price to pay, and this can even finish opponents off when they get low. Next up, there's Sin Prodder, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. Any opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard. If a player does, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to that card's converted mana cost, otherwise put that card into your hand. With the amount of damage that we're going to be dealing out with this deck, it's going to be very hard for our opponents to justify not letting us take the card. Another tough decision for our opponents comes from Indulgent Tormentor. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card unless target opponent sacrifices a creature or pays 3 life. Next up, we've got Theater of Horrors, Outpost Siege, and Vance's Blasting Cannons. Theater of Horrors says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library, and during your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. We've got plenty of ways to make our opponents lose life, so activating this should be no problem. And Outpost Siege and Vance's Blasting Cannons essentially do the exact same thing, but without that life loss requirement. And finally, we're running 2 tutors with Diabolic Tutor and Final Parting. Diabolic Tutor is just a standard tutor. It's going to get us 1 card into our hand. And then Final Parting is going to get us 2 cards, 1 goes into our hand and 1 goes into our graveyard. This can essentially give us some really cheap value by putting something like Cut to Ribbons in our graveyard. Now, outside of just trying to finish off our opponents first, we've got some other ways to protect ourselves too. Let's go over them now in tactic number 8, Deter and Dismiss. First up, there's Hissing Miasma and Blood Reckoning, both of which do the exact same thing in this deck. Whenever a creature attacks us, its controller loses 1 life. So this can not only deter attacks, but it can actually take our opponent's life totals down even further if they choose to attack us. Next up, there's Sun Droplet, which says whenever you dealt damage, put that many charge counters on Sun Droplet. And at each upkeep, we can remove a charge counter to gain 1 life. So essentially, each time around the table, we can gain back 4 life with this. Finally, there's Urza's Armor, which says if a source would deal damage to you, prevent 1 of that damage. So this card can have a heavy investment, but it can also save us a ton of damage in the long run. Now, prevention can be great, but we've also got some proactive ways to deal with our opponent's things too. So now let's move on to tactic number 9, Less is More. First up, there's Rakdos Charm, which says choose 1. Exile all cards from target player's graveyard, destroy target artifact, or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. Each of these are fantastic modes for this deck, and if we're set up correctly, that last one can be especially deadly. And then there's Chaos Warp, which says the owner of target permanent shuffles it into the library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. This can just be a great catch-all card that can deal with pretty much everything. Next up, we have some ways to deal with hands with Rakdos' Return and Sire of Insanity. Rakdos' Return is going to deal X damage to target opponent, and that player discards X cards. And then Sire of Insanity says at the beginning of each end step, each player discards their hand. Getting rid of hands can really throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. Next up, there's Plaguecrafter, which when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and each player who can't discards a card. This is a great small way to attack opponents on multiple fronts. And finally, there's Death Pits of Wrath, which says whenever a creature is dealt damage, destroy it, it can't be regenerated. This can make attacking and blocking very difficult for all of our opponents, and it can also make some of our next spells even more powerful. So let's move on to our final tactic, tactic number 10, Wipe Out. First up, there's Chain Reaction, which is going to deal X damage to each creature where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So this can easily destroy all creatures and leave Mogis in play. Next up, there's Earthquake, which is going to deal X damage to each creature without flying in each player. So this can be a good way to wrath the board on top of finishing opponents off. Another way could be with Arc Bond, which says choose target creature. Whenever that creature is dealt damage this turn, it deals that much damage to each other creature and each player. Next up, there's Archfiend of Depravity, which says at the beginning of each opponent's end step, that player chooses up to 2 creatures they control, then sacrifices the rest. This card is extremely effective at keeping our opponent's boards low and making them make some tough decisions. And finally, there's Last One Standing, which says choose a creature at random, then destroy the rest. At just 3 mana, this is an extremely efficient board wipe. And because Mogis is indestructible, even if he's not chosen, he's gonna live. And by decimating opponents' boards, Mogis is gonna deal even more damage to them. Group Slug decks are a ton of fun to build and play. Again, a huge thanks to Brandon for supporting this channel for over a year as a general tier patron. If you also want to support this channel or want your own deck tech dedicated to you, consider becoming a patron. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, we've got Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to get a basic land and play tapped. Then we've got Urborg Volcano, Cinder Barrens, Rakdos Gilgate, Bloodfell Caves, and Akulum Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either black or red mana. Next up, there's Rakdos Carnarium, which enters the battlefield tapped, bounces land back to our hand, but it taps for black-red. And then we're running 2 of the Vivid lands with Vivid Crag and Vivid Marsh. Finally, we've got 26 basic lands, 14 of those are going to be mountains, and 12 will be swamps. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGplayer optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Mogis EDH rec deck will set you back $276.82. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $49.77. Again, the price of this deck is the price that I got for it on the day that I'm recording. If you want to see a breakdown of this deck's cost, check out the link in the description. Keep in mind that prices can and will fluctuate and change over time. But with these deck costs, I want to be as transparent as I possibly can. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades now to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, let's add in Felwar Stone and take out Sphere of the Suns. Felwar Stone is just a much more effective mana rock. And then let's add in Whip of Erebos and take out Plague Crafter. Giving all of our creatures lifelink can be a huge way to gain some life back. Next up, let's add in Underworld Dreams and take out Rakdos' Return. Underworld Dreams is just a great way to punish our opponents for drawing cards. And then let's add in Twilight Prophet and take out Death Pits of Wrath. Twilight Prophet can give us card advantage on top of draining our opponents. Next up, let's add in Tree of Perdition and take out Urza's Armor. Setting an opponent's life total down to 13 is a death sentence. And finally, we're going to add Master of Cruelties and take out Blood Reckoning. Master of Cruelties goes even further by setting an opponent's life total down to 1. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this deck tech are. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future Commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget Commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.